Tonight, we're going to talk about the Vikings, not the horned helmet cartoon of school pageants, and not the growling caricature of 100 bad films. The actual people. The ones who put out from the fjords of Norway and the flat coasts of Denmark and the long forested rivers of Sweden, and across roughly 3 centuries, made themselves the single most consequential story in early medieval Europe. Raiders, yes, but also traders, settlers, explorers, mercenaries, kings, poets, and shipbuilders of a talent that historians are still, in a mildly grudging way, trying to fully account for. We're going to follow them from a summer morning on a small English island, where nobody yet knew that anything had changed, all the way to a muddy field in southern England nearly 3 centuries later, where the story ends in a way that is either a defeat or a victory, depending on which grandsons you happen to be counting. If you're new here, welcome. And if you've been with us before, genuinely glad you came back. Take a moment to hit like and subscribe if you enjoy what we do, and drop your location and local time in the comments below. It sounds like a small thing, but people from every corner of the world find their way to these stories at the end of a long day, and there is something quietly wonderful about that. Someone in Reykjavik at midnight, someone in Auckland with the sun already coming up, someone in a small town in Ohio at 2 in the morning who can't quite sleep. All of you landing in the same story tonight. Now go ahead and get comfortable. Find your position. Loosen the blanket. Let the shoulders settle. You do not need to follow every detail tonight, and you certainly don't need to remember the names. Just let the story come to you. Before the Vikings were the Vikings, they were something considerably harder to see from outside. Scandinavia in the 8th century was not a single kingdom, or a single culture, or a single people with a name for itself. It was a broad landscape of small farming communities, fishing villages, and regional chieftains spread across an enormous area of mountain, forest, coastline, and cold sea. The population was small. The winters were long. The soil, in most places, was thin and stony and demanded far more work than it politely offered in return. What Scandinavia had in abundance was water. Rivers that ran deep enough to move a boat, coastline that broke into countless sheltered inlets, and beyond it all, the great grey stretches of the North Sea and the Baltic, which the people of these communities had been navigating for as long as anyone could remember. They were not, in any meaningful sense, isolated. They traded with the peoples of what is now northern Germany and the Baltic coast. They knew in vague terms of the Frankish Empire to the south and of the British and Irish kingdoms to the west. They exchanged furs, walrus ivory, amber, and iron for silver, glass, and the occasional cask of wine that had traveled north through a chain of intermediaries none of them had ever met. Their gods were the ones we still half remember. Odin, one-eyed and unreliable, wandering through the world in a wide-brimmed hat, looking for wisdom he was willing to sacrifice a great deal to obtain. Thor, the red-bearded thunder god, hammer in hand, less complicated than his father and considerably easier to like. Freya, presiding over love and war and death in a way that refused to separate any of them tidily. Loki, whose presence in any story generally meant that things were about to become considerably worse before they became better. Their society was ordered around the household, the extended family, and the local assembly, called a thing, where free men gathered to settle disputes, adjudicate quarrels, and make the decisions that a community too small for kings still needed to make somehow. They had a writing system, the runic alphabet, though they used it sparingly, mostly for inscriptions on stone and objects rather than for extended composition. Their poetry, which was extraordinary, was memorized and recited aloud, passed from one generation of skalds to the next in a form so intricate that later scholars have found themselves quietly impressed by the sheer cognitive engineering involved. Kennings, the compressed metaphors that stood in for common words. The sea was the whale road. Battle was the storm of swords. A ship was the horse of the waves. Everything, in Norse verse, was worth describing by way of something else, as if the direct approach were a kind of failure of imagination. They had, above all, the ships. And this is where the story of the Viking Age genuinely begins, because everything else that happens over the next 3 centuries depends on a particular piece of shipbuilding technology that developed slowly in Scandinavian waters through the 6th 7th, and 8th centuries, and reached, at the end of the 700s, a level of refinement that gave its makers a capability nobody else in Europe possessed. The Norse longship was a clinker-built vessel, meaning its hull planks overlapped like the shingles of a roof, held together with iron rivets and caulked with wool soaked in tar. It carried a single square sail on a central mast, which could be raised or lowered quickly, and a full complement of oars along both sides for when the wind failed or when precision was required. Its keel was long and shallow. Its draft, the depth of water it needed to float, was in some cases less than a meter. It could cross the open ocean under sail. It could be rowed directly up a river. It could be beached on an open shore without a harbor. It could be dragged across land between waterways when the geography demanded it. It was, in practical terms, the most versatile ship anyone in Europe had built up to that point, and the people who built it understood exactly what they had. For most of the 8th century, they used it for trade and travel within their own world. Then, sometime around the 780s, something in the calculation changed. Historians have argued about the precise mixture of causes for over a century, and the honest answer is that it was probably several things pressing at once. Population had grown enough that available farmland was under pressure, particularly in Norway, where flat ground was scarce to begin with. Inheritance customs in many Norse communities favored the eldest son, which meant that younger sons, healthy, ambitious, and armed, had every reason to look elsewhere for what they could not inherit at home. Political consolidation was beginning in parts of Scandinavia, particularly in Norway under a king who would eventually be called Harald Fairhair, and this consolidation pushed out those who preferred not to be consolidated. And the wider world, viewed from a Norse deck, had begun to look increasingly rich, increasingly poorly defended, and increasingly reachable in ways that had not seemed obvious even a generation earlier. The first documented raid on Britain came in 789, when 3 Norse ships put in near Portland on the Dorset coast. A royal official rowed down to meet them, on the entirely reasonable assumption that they were merchants who needed to be registered and taxed. He was killed on the beach. The incident was recorded, filed, and largely absorbed into the general background of coastal incidents that any long coastline eventually accumulates. Nobody at the time saw it as the beginning of anything. It was a single, ugly episode, disturbing certainly, but not the kind of thing that reshaped how one thought about the sea. 4 years later, on a clear morning in June of 793 AD, that changed. The place was Lindisfarne, a small tidal island off the northeastern coast of Northumbria in what is now northeast England. The island itself was modest, low and grassy, connected to the mainland at low tide by a causeway of wet sand that disappeared when the water came back in. What made it significant was what stood on it. A monastery, founded in the 630s by an Irish monk named Aidan and grown across the following century, and a half into one of the most celebrated centers of Christian learning in all of Northern Europe. Its monks had produced the Lindisfarne Gospels, an illuminated manuscript so intricate that modern scholars have concluded certain of its pages must have been executed with a magnifying lens, though no such lens has ever been found from the period. It held silver chalices, gold reliquaries, and the accumulated wealth of over a century of royal gifts and pious donations. It housed the bones of Saint Cuthbert, the most revered holy man of the Northern English Church. It was, by any reasonable measure, one of the richest, holiest, and most defenseless targets in all of Britain. The monks that morning would have been about their ordinary work. Prayer, agriculture, the copying of manuscripts in the scriptorium, the tending of the sick in the small community that had grown up around them. The monastery had been on that island for 160 years without serious incident. There was no reason to expect that this particular morning would be different from any of the mornings before it. When someone first noticed the sails coming in fast from the northeast on a following wind, the immediate assumption would have been trade. Ships arrived at Lindisfarne. That was not unusual. Ships had always arrived at Lindisfarne. Traders, pilgrims, official messengers from Northumbrian kings, monks visiting from other communities. The sails would have been observed, remarked upon, and expected to result in the ordinary business of a small monastery receiving a small visit. The men who came off those ships were carrying axes, and what they did to Lindisfarne over the following hours is the moment when the Viking Age, as an event in European history, quietly, terribly begins. What happened at Lindisfarne on that June morning in 793 was, by the standards of what would come later, not particularly large in scale. A single raiding party, a handful of ships, some hours of violence. But the psychological impact was disproportionate to the physical damage in a way that historians have been trying to properly account for ever since. Monks were killed. Others were dragged into the ships and taken away, presumably to be sold in the slave markets of Dublin or the Baltic. Some were drowned. The altar was stripped. The reliquaries were emptied. The manuscripts that could be quickly carried were taken. Those that could not were left, or torn, or thrown down. The community that had preyed on that island for 160 years was, in the space of a single tide, broken. The ships were gone before help could arrive. And when word of what had happened reached the wider Christian world, the response was something close to genuine bewilderment. Alcuin of York, one of the leading intellectuals of the age, and at the time working at the court of the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne, wrote in horror to the surviving monks and to the Northumbrian king. His letter is the closest thing we have to a contemporary emotional response, and its central note is one of a world order that has been violently interrupted. Never before, he wrote, had such a thing been seen in Britain. The sanctuary of a holy place had been violated. The bodies of saints had been trampled by pagans. What sin, he wanted to know, could possibly have provoked such a punishment from God? The framing was theological because in the 8th century that was the only framing available. Catastrophe was always the consequence of sin. If a monastery had been sacked, it was because the monastery, or the kingdom that contained it, or the age itself, had drifted into some form of moral failure that had now been chastised. Alcuin catalogued possibilities: vanity in dress, laxity in observance, kings who had strayed from the guidance of their bishops. It was, in its way, an entirely reasonable set of possibilities to raise. What Alcuin could not do, because nobody at the time could yet do it, was see the raid as part of a pattern that had nothing to do with the moral condition of the English Church, and everything to do with certain young men in Norway looking at certain undefended coastlines and reaching certain practical conclusions. The following year, in 794, the monastery of Jarrow was hit. This was the very community where the Venerable Bede had lived and worked, and where the ecclesiastical history of the English people had been composed only 60 years earlier. The year after that, in 795, Iona was raided, the celebrated island monastery off the western coast of Scotland, founded by Saint Columba, which had for 2 centuries served as one of the great centres of Irish and Scottish Christianity. Iona would be raided again in 802, and again in 806, when 68 of its monks were killed in a single attack. The pattern was becoming visible. The Norse were coming, and they were coming systematically, and the targets were the undefended treasure houses of the Christian coasts. Monasteries were, by the internal logic of their own design and placement, almost perfectly optimized to be robbed. They held wealth in concentrated form. They stood in the open, often on islands or riverbanks or exposed headlands, chosen for their beauty and for their proximity to water routes that were now serving purposes their founders had not remotely anticipated. They had no walls of any consequence. Their inhabitants had chosen their way of life precisely because it excluded the training and equipment of professional soldiers. The Christian world had built its holiest places on the assumption that their holiness would protect them, and had discovered, over the course of a decade, that this assumption did not survive contact with people who did not share it. But it would be wrong, and it has been wrong in a lot of popular history, to imagine that the Norse were operating from any particular theological hostility toward Christianity. They were not on a religious campaign. They raided non-Christian communities with equal enthusiasm when those communities had something worth taking. They robbed Slavic settlements on the Baltic coast. They robbed each other. The Christian monasteries were targets because they were rich and undefended, not because their crosses gave offense. The Norse gods were sufficiently secure in their own position that they did not, on the whole, require their worshippers to persecute anyone else's. Odin was busy enough with his own concerns. Through the last decade of the 8th century and the first decades of the 9th, the pattern intensified and expanded. The raids reached Ireland, where the wealthy monasteries of the Irish Golden Age were, if anything, even more richly furnished and even less prepared than their British counterparts. The Annals of Ulster, an Irish monastic chronicle, records the arrival of the ships with a kind of stunned brevity that becomes almost rhythmic across the pages. The Norse plundered such and such a place. The Norse burned such and such a monastery. The Norse took such and such a number of captives. Whole communities of Irish monks were carried off to Dublin, which the Norse would eventually turn into a permanent settlement of their own, a slave trading port whose population of captive Christians helped fund the trade networks that stretched from the Irish Sea to the Baltic and beyond. The raids reached the Frankish coast, where Charlemagne, still living and still ruling one of the largest empires Europe had seen since the Romans, watched them arrive with a considerable frustration and less ability to prevent them than he was accustomed to possessing. Frankish ports were attacked. Monastic communities on the coasts of Frisia and northern Gaul were hit repeatedly. Charlemagne ordered the construction of a coastal defense network. It was completed after his death, and it did not stop the raiders, because a fixed defense network is a poor answer to a highly mobile enemy who can simply choose to arrive somewhere else. By the second and third decades of the 9th century, the raids were reaching the Mediterranean. Norse ships attacked Lisbon in 844. They attacked Seville the same year, penetrated up the Guadalquivir River, and were only turned back by the counterattack of the Emir of Cordoba, whose forces killed a significant number of the raiders and captured the ships. The Norse who survived the battle were, according to later Arabic sources, offered the opportunity to convert to Islam and settle as farmers, which some of them apparently accepted. This is not the sort of detail that fits neatly into the standard picture of the Viking Age, and precisely for that reason it deserves to be remembered. History rarely happens in the shape one expects it to. Norse ships reached the Balearic Islands. They reached the coast of North Africa. They reached, on at least one expedition, all the way to the coast of southern Italy. The reach of the longship, and of the men who sailed it, was already extending far beyond what any of the monks at Lindisfarne could have conceived of on the morning their world ended. But the raids on Britain remained, throughout this period, the ones that most consistently produced consequences that could be measured and remembered. Small parties struck the coasts of Northumbria and East Anglia and Kent. Larger parties began to overwinter, first on offshore islands like Sheppey in the Thames estuary, where a Norse force established a base as early as 851, and then, increasingly, on the mainland itself. The transition from seasonal raiding to sustained presence was gradual, and its early stages were probably not fully understood by the English kings whose lands were being encroached upon. Each individual overwintering could be interpreted as an isolated inconvenience. Each new arrival could be treated as a separate problem. What the English were slow to see was that the pattern itself was changing. The men in the ships were no longer travelers who intended to go home. They were beginning to consider the possibility that they were already home, or could be. The Kingdom of Wessex, under a series of capable kings running through the first half of the 9th century, held its coastline more successfully than most of its neighbours. Egbert of Wessex, who reigned from 802 to 839, defeated a combined force of Cornish Britons and Norse raiders at Hingston Down in 838, an engagement that demonstrated both that the raiders were now willing to ally with local powers against the English, and that Wessex was capable of dealing with such combinations when it had to. His grandson Ethelwulf, who succeeded through the middle decades of the century, won a significant victory at Aclear in 851 against what the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called the largest Norse force that had yet appeared on English soil. The Chronicle records the Norse dead as the greatest slaughter of heathen host that had been made up to that day. The English were learning how to fight the raiders. But learning to fight raiders is not the same as learning to fight an army, and what was about to arrive was going to require an entirely different response. In the autumn of 865, ships put in on the East Anglian coast, and what came off them was not a raiding party. It was a force organized on a scale that the English had never previously encountered. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle called it the Missile here, which translates from Old English as the Great Army, though the version that has entered popular memory carries a more specific coloring, the Great Heathen Army. Its size is impossible to determine with any precision. Modern historians have argued for numbers ranging from around 1,000 men at the low end to several thousand at the high end. The Norse sagas, written centuries later and never particularly reliable when it came to counting, offered figures that were considerably higher. What matters is not the exact head count, but the organizational scale. This was not a party of ambitious young men from a single Norse community, seeking a quick profit and a return voyage before winter. This was a coalition drawn from across the Norse world, with a leadership structure, a strategic plan, and the clear intention of not going home until it had taken what it had come for. The leaders most consistently associated with this army are the sons of a Norse warrior who has come down to us under the name Ragnar Lothbrok, Ivar, called the Boneless, his brothers Halfdan and Ub. Whether Ragnar himself was an actual historical figure or a composite legend assembled from the accumulated reputations of several different men has been debated by scholars of the Norse world without resolution for well over a century. His sons, however, were unambiguously real, and what they did over the following decade would rearrange the political map of Britain more completely than anything since the Anglo-Saxon migrations 400 years earlier. The great heathen army wintered in East Anglia. It took horses from the local king, who was hopping to buy peace at a price he could manage. And in the following spring, it turned north and began to march on York, and the world the English had built for themselves across 3 centuries was about to be tested in a way that most of the kingdoms in it would not survive. York in the year 866 was called Earforwick, and it was the beating heart of the kingdom of Northumbria. It had grown from a Roman fortress into a substantial Anglo-Saxon town, with a cathedral, a scriptorium of some reputation, a bustling market that drew traders from as far as the Frankish coast, and a population that made it the second largest urban settlement in England after London. It sat on the River Ouse, which was navigable directly from the sea, and this navigability, which had once made it a prosperous trading centre, was about to become the reason it fell. The timing of the great heathen army's move on York was carefully chosen. Northumbria at that moment was consumed by a civil war between 2 rival claimants to the throne, a man named Osbert, who had been deposed some years earlier, and his replacement Aela, whose legitimacy was contested by half the kingdom's nobility. The Norse arrived to find a kingdom whose military force was divided against itself, whose leadership was distracted by internal quarrels, and whose defensive attention was pointed inward rather than at the river. York fell on the 1st of November 866, which is All Saints' Day, and the fact that the attack came on a major Christian feast has led some historians to suggest that the Norse commanders had a genuinely sophisticated understanding of when their enemies would be least prepared to fight. The response was slow. It took the 2 rival Northumbrian kings until the following March to compose their differences sufficiently to raise a combined army, and by then the Norse had spent 5 months fortifying the town, reinforcing its walls, and preparing exactly the kind of defensive fight that would suit them best. Osbert and Aela marched on York on the 21st of March 867. They breached the walls. They pursued the Norse into the narrow streets of the town. And there, in the confined spaces where numerical advantage counted for less than close-quarters discipline, the Northumbrian army was destroyed. Both kings were killed in the fighting. According to later Norse sagas, Aela was captured alive and subjected to the Blood Eagle, a ritual execution whose historicity is contested by modern scholars, but whose place in the Norse literary imagination is unambiguous. Whether it happened or not, the fact that the story attached itself to that particular king suggests something about the emotional weight the fall of York carried for both sides. Northumbria, as a functioning independent kingdom effectively ended at that moment. A compliant client king was installed to manage the region on Norse terms. The great heathen army moved on. Its next target was Mercia, the large Midland kingdom that had, a century earlier under King Offa, been the dominant power in England. The Norse wintered at Nottingham in 867, and the Mercian king Burgred, understanding that he could not defeat them in the field, appealed to Wessex for help. The Wessex king Ethelred, whose younger brother we shall come to shortly, marched north with an army. But when the combined English force reached Nottingham, they found the Norse behind walls they were not equipped to storm. A negotiated settlement was reached. Payment was made. The Norse departed, having demonstrated once again the principle that would define the entire period. They could be paid to leave, but they could not be defeated in any lasting way, and the payments only encouraged the return. They returned to East Anglia. And there, in 869, they encountered the young King Edmund, who was about to earn a place in English history that his political achievements could not have won for him. Edmund had ruled East Anglia for roughly 14 years. He was in his late 20s, unmarried, pious, and when the Norse army marched into his kingdom demanding tribute and submission, entirely clear about what he was willing to do and what he was not. The details of what followed are preserved in a life written a century later by a monk named Abba of Fleury, working from the testimony of an aged man who claimed to have been Edmund's armor-bearer. The account is hagiographic in tone and no doubt embellished in its dramatic beats, but its essential outline is broadly accepted. Edmund was offered terms. He would keep his kingdom as a Norse vassal, but he would have to renounce his Christianity and rule in the name of the pagan gods of his conquerors. He refused. He was captured. He was tied to a tree, and he was shot with arrows until his body, according to the chronicler's memorable phrase, resembled a thistle covered in prickles. When he still refused to renounce his faith, he was beheaded. Edmund's death made him a martyr almost immediately. His body was recovered, reportedly with the head miraculously reunited to the neck through the intervention of a wolf that had guarded it in the forest. He was declared a saint. The town that grew around his shrine became known as Bury St. Edmunds, a name it still carries 11 centuries later. And East Anglia, like Northumbria before it, ceased to exist as an independent English kingdom. 3 of the 4 major Anglo-Saxon kingdoms had now been dismantled in the space of 5 years. The pattern was becoming impossible to misinterpret. The great heathen army was not raiding, it was conquering. And what its leaders had accomplished in less than half a decade was the systematic destruction of a political order that had taken the Anglo-Saxons close to 4 centuries to construct. Mercia's turn came in 874. King Burgred, the same man who had appealed to Wessex for help at Nottingham 7 years earlier, faced military pressure that had been grinding his kingdom down since then. When the Norse arrived in force at his capital of Repton, he did not fight. He left. He gathered what he could of his household, crossed the Channel, and travelled to Rome, where he lived out the remainder of his life in exile, and where he was eventually buried in the English quarter of the city. A Norse-installed replacement was placed on the Mercian throne, a man named Ceolwulf, whom the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes with the quiet contempt reserved for a puppet. His purpose was to keep the machinery of Mercian government running while the substance of Mercian power moved elsewhere. The Norse had, by the end of 874, effectively ended 3 of the 4 kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxon world. What they were building in the space these kingdoms had occupied was something new. Historians would later call it the Danelaw, meaning the region of England governed by Danish law and Danish custom. It stretched, in its fullest extent, from Northumbria in the north through the East Midlands and into East Anglia, covering perhaps half of the total land area of what we now call England. Within this region, Norse landholders replaced English ones. Norse legal categories governed local disputes. Norse place names spread across the map, and they spread with such thoroughness that the modern geography of English place names still bears the fingerprints of that settlement. Any village whose name ends in the suffix "by", from the Old Norse word for a farm or settlement, sits somewhere in the Old Danelaw. Grimsby, Derby, Whitby, Selby, Formby, and hundreds of others. Any village ending in thorp, a smaller outlying farmstead, or thwaite, a clearing, or toft, a homestead, carries the same inheritance. The map of England is, in significant part, a Norse map wearing an English pronunciation. The population of the Danelaw was not, of course, entirely replaced. The English who had lived on that land for centuries mostly remained on it. They now had new lords and paid their rents to new masters and gradually adopted certain Norse words and legal customs. But the genetic evidence drawn from modern populations in these regions suggests continuity of the underlying population alongside the arrival of a Norse ruling class. The two peoples intermarried. They traded. They worshipped increasingly in the same churches as the Norse settlers converted, generation by generation, to the Christianity of the land they now farmed. The Danelaw was not a foreign occupation in the sense that a modern military occupation would be. It was a slow, uneven, complicated absorption of one people into a landscape already occupied by another, and the result, over the following century and a half, would be a hybrid culture that produced some of the most interesting linguistic and legal effects in English history. But all of that was for the future. In the winter of 874, the reality on the ground was that the Anglo-Saxon world had one kingdom left, and that kingdom was under active threat. The Norse forces, having settled the Mercian question, turned their attentions southward and westward. They probed the borders of Wessex. They raided its coastlines. And in 875, a portion of the great army under a leader named Guthrum began a serious campaign against the last independent English kingdom. Wessex at that moment was ruled by a young man of 26 who had come to the throne 4 years earlier upon the death in battle of his elder brother Ethelred. His name was Alfred, and everything we know about him from contemporary sources suggests a person who was, by the standards of his time and station, unusual. He was physically frail, subject throughout his life to a chronic illness that modern scholars have variously diagnosed as Crohn's disease, hemorrhoids, or some combination of gastrointestinal conditions that would have made his daily life persistently uncomfortable. He was scholarly by inclination, which was rare among Anglo-Saxon kings, and he had, as a young man, been sent by his father on 2 separate pilgrimages to Rome, where he had absorbed impressions of a wider Christian world that most of his contemporaries would never see. He was pious. He was intelligent. And he was, when the moment required it, capable of a kind of stubborn refusal to accept defeat that had, in his brother's short reign, already been tested in ways that suggested it would be tested further. The initial phase of Guthrum's campaign against Wessex went badly for the English. The Norse forces moved fast, using cavalry mobility to strike deep into West Saxon territory before Alfred could concentrate his own army in response. In the summer of 876, Guthrum captured Wareham. In the autumn, he took Exeter. Alfred bought peace with each of these engagements, extracting oaths and hostages, and watching the Norse depart only to regroup elsewhere. The pattern of the previous decade was repeating itself. The English could not defeat the Norse in the field, could not prevent them from moving where they wished, and could only, at increasing cost, purchase temporary respites that never became permanent. Then, in the deep midwinter of January 878, Guthrum did something that no Anglo-Saxon king had reasonably expected. He attacked in winter. Campaigning in January simply was not done. The weather was too cold, the roads too poor, the food supplies too thin. Armies wintered in fortified positions and resumed operations in the spring. Guthrum, evidently having reached certain conclusions about the value of doing the thing his opponents did not expect, marched from his winter quarters at Gloucester and struck at Chippenham, where Alfred was spending the Christmas season with his court. The attack was catastrophic in its immediate effect. The West Saxon court scattered. The military command structure collapsed. Alfred, with a small group of followers, retreated into the marshes of Somerset, and for the first months of 878, the King of Wessex was, in any practical sense, a fugitive in his own kingdom. The Somerset marshes in January are among the least hospitable landscapes in the English lowlands. Flat, waterlogged, threaded with reed beds and narrow channels of standing water, They were, in the 9th century, considerably more extensive than they are now. A maze of half-drowned ground broken by low islands of firmer soil where a small community could live if it knew the paths well enough. It was into this landscape that Alfred retreated in the first weeks of 878, with what could not have been more than a few dozen loyal companions, no reliable communications with the wider kingdom, and no immediate prospect of relief. He established a base on one of these islands, at a place called Athelney. The name in Old English meant the Isle of Princes, which was either a happy coincidence or, more likely, a piece of retrospective naming applied after the events of that year gave the location its later fame. From Athelney, Alfred did what he could. He sent messengers to the fighting men of Somerset and Wiltshire and Hampshire, informing them that the king was still alive and still fighting. He conducted small raids against Norse-controlled territory to keep his presence known and to gather food. He waited, and it is from this period, more than any other, that the small legendary details attached themselves to his reputation, the stories that made him a figure of English folklore centuries, before he became a figure of English constitutional history. The most famous of these is the story of the cakes. Alfred, according to the account preserved in a life of him composed roughly a century after his death, took shelter one evening in the cottage of a swineherd whose wife did not recognize the disheveled and worn-looking man she was sheltering. She was baking, and she asked her guest to watch some flat cakes cooking on the hearth while she attended to other business. Alfred agreed. Then he sat by the fire and thought about his kingdom and his prospects, and the men who were dying because of decisions he had failed to make quickly enough, and the cakes burned. The woman came back, found the ruined food, and told the King of Wessex exactly what she thought of his competence as a cook in language that was, according to the chronicler, direct and unambiguous. Alfred, according to the same account, accepted the scolding without revealing who he was. The story is almost certainly embellished, and may be entirely invented. It survives in written form for the first time about 100 years after the events it describes, and it has all the hallmarks of the sort of folk narrative that attaches itself retrospectively to figures of legendary stature. But it survived for over 1,000 years because it captured something that generations of English readers found essentially plausible about the man. That he was capable of being so absorbed in larger problems that he missed the immediate one on fire directly in front of him. That he could accept correction from a peasant woman without insisting on the deference his rank entitled him to. That he possessed, in short, a certain combination of intellectual seriousness and personal humility that later generations would come to find distinctive. More concretely, and more consequentially, Alfred used the Athelney period to plan a return. By Easter of 878, in early April, he had established enough of a communications network with his loyal nobles across the region that he could send out summons for a general muster. The message went to Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. The fighting men of Wessex were to gather at a place called Egbert's Stone in the east of Somerset in the week following Easter. What Alfred was proposing was, by any reasonable calculation, a considerable gamble. The Norse army was intact, well supplied, and holding fortified positions across most of Wessex. The English response would have to be immediate, decisive, and successful in a single engagement, because there would be no opportunity for a second one. They came. The muster at Egbert's Stone drew a force that the Chronicle describes as filling all the surrounding countryside with rejoicing when they saw their king, whom they had believed dead. The size of the assembled army is not recorded with any precision, but it was sufficient. Alfred led it eastward, and on the third day of the campaign, they encountered Guthrum's forces at a place called Eddington, in Wiltshire, on high ground overlooking a valley that would have given the West Saxon commanders an excellent view of what they were about to attempt. The battle that followed on that day in early May 878 is one of the more decisive engagements in English history, and one about which we know remarkably little in tactical detail. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, spare as always, records that Alfred fought against the entire Norse army, that the fighting was fierce and long, and that the English put the Norse to flight. Later sources add that the West Saxon forces attacked in a shield wall formation, that they drove the Norse steadily backward across the field, and that the pursuit continued until the surviving Norse forces reached their fortified camp at Chippenham, where they took refuge behind walls that Alfred's army was not equipped to storm directly. So Alfred did what a besieging medieval army did in that situation. He surrounded the camp and waited. For 14 days, the Norse remained inside their defenses, and Alfred's forces remained outside them, and food and water inside the camp ran out. At the end of the fortnight, Guthrum and his surviving commanders sent word that they wished to negotiate. What Alfred did next is one of the more remarkable pieces of political theatre in the entire Viking Age, and its significance is not diminished by the fact that it was clearly deliberate. He did not demand Guthrum's death. He did not demand the immediate expulsion of all Norse forces from England. He did not even demand the surrender of the treasure Guthrum's army had accumulated over years of successful campaigning. He demanded, among other more practical concessions, that Guthrum accept Christian baptism. The ceremony took place a few weeks later at a place called Aula in Somerset, with a small chapel that has since disappeared entirely from the landscape. Alfred stood as Guthrum's godfather. The Norse king was given the baptismal name Athelstan, which was itself an act of remarkable political calculation, since it was a distinctly English royal name that Alfred was placing on a former enemy in a gesture that transformed him, at least ceremonially, from a foreign invader into a Christian sub-king within a broader English religious community. Guthrum spent the following 12 days at Alfred's court as an honored guest. There were feasts. There were exchanges of gifts. There was, presumably, considerable careful conversation about what the new arrangement would look like in practice. What followed was the Treaty of Wedmore, and then, some years later, a more formal document known as the Treaty of Alfred and Guthrum, which drew a boundary line across England. The line ran roughly from the mouth of the Thames, northwest, to the old Roman city of Chester. Everything east and north of the line would be governed under Norse law. Everything south and west would remain under Alfred's authority. It was, in effect, a formal recognition that England was going to be two things for the foreseeable future, and that the pretense of a single English political order had, for the moment, to be set aside in favor of a workable division. Alfred spent the 2 decades of his reign that followed Eddington doing something that no previous English king had really attempted at scale. He built, systematically, the institutional and physical infrastructure that would allow Wessex to defend itself against future Norse attacks, without depending on the desperate improvisation that had barely saved it in 878. His reforms are worth pausing on, because they are the reason that the story of England did not end in the 9th century. First came the burghs. Alfred ordered the construction of a network of fortified towns across the Kingdom of Wessex, positioned so that no point in the country was more than about 20 miles from one of them. Each burgh was surrounded by earthwork defenses and a wooden palisade, and each was garrisoned by a population maintained through a formula that assigned to every burgh a specific area of surrounding countryside, whose landholders were required to contribute men to its defense. The formula survives in a document called the Burgel-Hiddage, a piece of Anglo-Saxon administration that reads, to a modern eye, with an unexpectedly professional clarity. The burghs were not merely military installations. Many of them were laid out as planned towns, with streets on a grid, marketplaces and churches. Several of them, including Winchester, Oxford and Wareham, became the foundations of towns that still exist today. Alfred was not just building forts. He was, in a practical and physical sense, building the urban skeleton of a country. Second came the reorganization of the Fyrd, the citizen army. The old system, in which every eligible man was obligated to serve when summoned, had the fatal flaw that extended campaigns stripped the farms of the labor needed to keep the agricultural economy functioning. If a Fyrd was called out and kept in the field for months, the harvest failed and the kingdom starved, which was a poor way to win a war. Alfred divided the obligation. Half the eligible men would be on active service at any given time, while the other half remained on the land to work. They rotated. It was administrative work rather than military heroism, but it meant that Wessex could maintain a force in the field indefinitely without collapsing the economy that fed it. and this was a genuinely new capability in the history of Anglo-Saxon warfare. Third came the ships. The Norse had come by sea, and Alfred, having understood this with unusual clarity, ordered the construction of a fleet of longships built to his own specifications. Larger than the Norse vessels, according to the Chronicle, with higher sides and more oars, designed to give an English crew a fighting advantage in the sort of naval engagement that had previously been the exclusive province of the raiders. The design was, we are told, not entirely successful in practice. The first ships proved awkward to handle, and modifications had to be made, which is generally what happens when a scholar king draws up his own ship plans without consulting the shipwrights beforehand. The important point was not that Alfred's ships were superior. It was that Wessex now had ships at all, and that Norse fleets arriving on the coast would no longer find themselves entirely unopposed. Fourth, and this is the reform for which Alfred is most personally remembered, came the great project of learning. Alfred had noticed, and it disturbed him considerably, that literacy in Latin, which had been the mark of a serious ecclesiastical education for centuries, was in a state of severe decline across his kingdom. Monasteries that had once produced skilled scholars were now, in the aftermath of the Norse raids, populated by monks who could barely read the liturgy they recited daily. Alfred saw this decline as a civilizational crisis, and he responded to it with an intellectual program that was almost without precedent in early medieval kingship. Alfred taught himself to read Latin as an adult. This detail, casually mentioned in the writings of the Welsh monk Asser who served at his court and eventually composed a biography of him, is worth pausing on. Anglo-Saxon kings were not, as a general rule, expected to be literate in any language, let alone in Latin, which was the specialized property of the clergy. A king was expected to fight, to govern, to give gifts, to be seen at feasts. Reading was not one of the required royal accomplishments. Alfred, having reached his mid-30s without acquiring this skill, decided in the middle of his reign that he needed it, and he acquired it, apparently through a combination of stubborn application and the patient tutoring of the scholars he had brought to his court from Wales, Mercia, and the continent. Once he could read Latin, he set about the project of translation. He identified a handful of works which he considered essential for the education of the English people, and he organized a program of rendering them from Latin into Old English. The choice of texts is illuminating in itself. He chose Pope Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care, a handbook for bishops and religious leaders on the responsibilities of spiritual authority. He chose Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People, the foundational narrative of English Christianity and, by extension, of English identity. He chose Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, that late Roman meditation on fortune and virtue that had become one of the most influential works of Christian philosophy in the West. He chose the soliloquies of St. Augustine. He chose the first 50 Psalms. He did not merely commission these translations. He worked on several of them himself, and where his prefaces survive, they show a mind that was engaged with what it was translating rather than merely reproducing it. His preface to Pastoral Care contains one of the most quoted passages in Anglo-Saxon prose, in which he describes the state of learning in England before the Viking raids, mourns its collapse, and states plainly his intention to restore what has been lost by making the essential books available to any free-born young man in the kingdom who had the leisure to devote himself to them. The word, leisure, is doing considerable work in that sentence. Alfred understood that literacy required time, and that time required a certain economic security, and that economic security required the kind of stable, defended kingdom that all his other reforms were designed to produce. The intellectual project and the military project were not separate. They were the same project, viewed from different angles. He also initiated what would become the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, a year-by-year record of English history maintained at several monasteries simultaneously, which would continue to be updated for nearly 3 centuries after his death, and which is one of the single most important documents for reconstructing the history of medieval England. Alfred did not write it himself, but the project carries his fingerprints clearly. It was an attempt to give the English a written memory of themselves, in their own language, that they could pass forward to whatever generations came next. Alfred died in October of 899, aged around 50. His reign had lasted 28 years, and he had achieved something that no other English king in the entire Viking Age would quite match. He had ensured that Wessex survived. He had built the institutional apparatus that would allow his successors to expand what he had preserved. And he had, more subtly, done something to the idea of Englishness itself. Before Alfred, an English person was primarily a subject of a particular kingdom, Northumbrian or Mercian or Kentish or West Saxon. After Alfred, the idea of a single English people with a single English language and a single Christian faith and a single common history began to be something that could be spoken of without embarrassment. The unification would take another 60 years to complete in political terms, but the concept had a foundation now, and it had a founder, and both would matter enormously to what came next. Meanwhile, and this is a critical point that the standard narrative of the Viking Age too often obscures, the men and women who had come out of Scandinavia were doing considerably more than raiding the coasts of Britain. The Norse world in the 9th and 10th centuries was a world in motion in every direction simultaneously, and while the events in England were dramatic, they were only one panel in a much larger picture. To understand the Viking Age properly, we need to look eastward. Because while the Danes were carving out the Danelaw, another Norse people, primarily from what is now Sweden, were doing something entirely different and arguably more consequential in the long run. They were following the rivers. The eastward Norse, whom the Slavic peoples they encountered called the Rus, and from whom the modern names Russia and Belarus eventually derive, were less interested in raiding than in trade. The geography they faced made raiding an inefficient business. The Slavic settlements of the great forested plains east of the Baltic were not concentrated wealthy monasteries with silver on the altars and manuscripts in the scriptorium. They were dispersed agricultural communities, harder to loot profitably. What they did have, in enormous supply, was access to the river networks that flowed from the north into the Black Sea and the Caspian, and beyond those seas lay the fabulously wealthy markets of Constantinople and the Islamic Caliphate. If you could get furs and slaves and amber down those rivers, you could sell them for silver and silk and glass and spices, and you could bring these goods back north through the same network. The Norse who understood this developed, over the course of the 9th century, one of the most sophisticated long-distance trade networks in the medieval world. Their ships were smaller than the ocean-going longships of the Western Vikings, adapted for river work. They were shallow-drafted, easy to portage across the strips of land that separated one river system from another. Where the Dnieper became impassable at its notorious series of rapids, the Norse traders would haul their boats overland, roll them on logs past the white water, and put them back in the river downstream. Where the rivers ran out entirely between the Baltic and the Volga systems, they would drag the boats across country for miles at a stretch. It was a business that required extraordinary physical stamina, detailed geographic knowledge passed down through generations, and a willingness to trust one's life to a network of trading posts and portage sites strung out across thousands of miles of forest and steppe. Along these routes, the Norse founded settlements that became permanent. Novgorod, on the Volkhov River, north of what would become Moscow, was one of the earliest, established in the 9th century and eventually growing into one of the great trading cities of medieval Eastern Europe. Kiev, on the Dnieper, became another. Both were originally Norse-founded settlements that gradually absorbed, and were absorbed by the Slavic populations around them, producing over the course of 2 centuries the hybrid civilization known as Kievan Rus, the political and cultural foundation of what would eventually become Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The traditional Russian chronicle known as the Primary Chronicle, composed centuries later, records that the Slavic tribes of the region actually invited a Norse leader named Rurik to come and rule over them because they were tired of quarreling among themselves. This story is almost certainly a diplomatic simplification of a more complicated process, but it captures something essentially true, which is that the Norse presence in the East was not primarily an armed intrusion, but a gradual integration. The Norse traders who made it all the way down the Dnieper eventually reached Constantinople, which they called Miklagard, meaning the great city. And Constantinople at that moment was the largest, wealthiest, and most sophisticated city in the entire Christian world. The Byzantine Empire had held together, in modified form, everything that had collapsed in the Western Roman Empire 4 centuries earlier. Its capital had a population of several 100,000. Its markets were stocked with goods from as far as India and China. Its hippodrome could seat 60,000 spectators, and its walls were the most formidable defensive fortifications anywhere in Europe. To a Norse trader arriving at the mouth of the Bosphorus after a journey of 2 or 3 thousand miles, Constantinople must have looked like the physical embodiment of another civilization entirely, which, in a certain sense, it was. The Byzantine emperors, having encountered these northerners in the 9th and 10th centuries, formed a rather high opinion of them as fighters and eventually created a specialized military unit composed entirely of Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors. This unit was called the Varangian Guard, and it served as the personal bodyguard of the Byzantine emperor for over 3 centuries. The Varangians were paid extraordinarily well, given quarters in the imperial palace, and used as the shock troops in any campaign where the emperor wanted men whose loyalty to him personally could not be complicated by their local political allegiances, because they had no local political allegiances. They were Norwegians, Swedes, and Icelanders, and later Englishmen fleeing the Norman conquest, and they had come to Constantinople for gold and glory, and they served with a reputation for reliability that made them the elite formation of the Byzantine military for the entirety of the Middle Byzantine period. The most famous Varangian, and the one whose subsequent career would loop this story back to the events with which we began, was a young Norwegian nobleman named Harald Sigurdsson. He arrived in Constantinople sometime around 1034, having fled his homeland after a failed political struggle, and he served in the Varangian Guard for approximately a decade. He fought campaigns in Sicily against the Arabs. He fought in Bulgaria. He fought in what is now Israel and Syria. He acquired, through a combination of skill, luck, and the careful accumulation of a share of the imperial treasury that Varangians were entitled to at the death of each emperor, an enormous personal fortune. He acquired the nickname by which he would be known for the rest of his life, Hardrada, meaning hard ruler or hard counsel. And when he eventually returned north in the 1040s, he would take his fortune, his reputation, and his military experience back to Norway, where he would claim the throne, hold it for 2 decades, and at the age of 51, sail west with the largest Norse invasion fleet that had crossed the North Sea in a generation, on a campaign whose ending we already know but have not yet reached. Harald Hardrada is our thread. He will return. For now, the point is that the Norse world in the 10th century was reaching almost everywhere that could be reached by water, and its trading and fighting men were doing things whose scale historians are still, quite frankly, trying to fully comprehend. If the eastward Norse were following rivers into empires, the westward Norse were doing something even stranger. They were sailing into empty water on the reasonable assumption that if they kept going long enough, something would eventually turn up. And in one of the more improbable stretches of medieval exploration, they were correct. The story of the North Atlantic Vikings begins, as much of the story does, with pressure at home. Norway in the second half of the 9th century was undergoing a slow political consolidation under a king named Harald Fairhair, whose ambition to unify the country under a single monarchy involved, as such projects generally do, the systematic removal of anyone who preferred not to be unified. The chieftains who lost these local conflicts had a range of options. They could submit, they could die, or they could put their households, their livestock, their weapons, and everything else they could load onto a ship and go somewhere Harold could not reach them. A considerable number chose the third option, and where they went first was the Faroe Islands, a scattering of steep and windswept rocks in the middle of the North Atlantic that had been previously inhabited only by a small community of Irish hermits, whose contemplative solitude was now interrupted by the arrival of considerably less contemplative Norwegian refugees. The Irish monks, we are told, chose to leave. From the Faroes, the next step west was Iceland. The traditional date of the first Norse settlement is 874, though there had been earlier reconnaissance voyages, and the Irish hermits had beaten the Norse there by a comfortable margin as well. The first permanent Norse settler is remembered by name in the Icelandic sagas as Ingolfur Arnarsson, who arrived with his household and cast the wooden pillars of his high seat into the sea as he approached the coast, in accordance with a custom that let the gods decide where he should build his farm. The pillars washed ashore at a bay on the southwestern coast, and the settlement Ingolfur built there was named for the columns of steam that rose from the local hot springs. He called it Reykjavik, meaning Smoky Bay, and it is still called that. It is now the capital of Iceland. What happened in Iceland over the following century is a genuine curiosity in the history of medieval Europe. The settlers who came in the Great Migration of the late 9th and early 10th centuries were, by and large, people who had left Norway specifically because they objected to being ruled by a king. When they established their new society, they organized it accordingly. There was no king in Iceland. There was no central government in the ordinary medieval sense. There were chieftains, called Gothar, who held religious and political authority over their local communities, but there was no single authority above them. Instead, the Icelanders created something almost without precedent in early medieval Europe. In the year 930, they established a general assembly, called the Althing, which met annually at a site called Thingvellir in the southwest of the country. Every free man in Iceland had the right to attend. Laws were passed by consensus. Disputes were adjudicated by elected judges. The presiding official, called the law speaker, was elected for a 3-year term and was responsible for reciting the entire body of Icelandic law from memory over the course of the annual assembly, 1/3 each year. The Althing has a reasonable claim to be the oldest continuously functioning parliament in the world. It has met, with some interruptions, every year since 930, and it is still the name of the modern Icelandic legislature. This achievement, produced by a small population of farmers and fishermen on a subarctic volcanic island in the middle of the North Atlantic, is easy to underestimate and worth taking seriously. The Icelanders had created, essentially by themselves, a functioning legal and political system without kings, and they had done it in the same century that most of the rest of Europe was still trying to work out how to prevent its kings from murdering each other in succession disputes. The Icelanders also produced, in the 2.5 centuries following their settlement, one of the great literary traditions of medieval Europe. The Icelandic sagas, composed in Old Norse in the 12th and 13th centuries, but drawing on oral traditions that ran back to the settlement itself, are a body of prose narrative that has no real equivalent anywhere else in early medieval writing. They tell the stories of the settlers and their descendants, their feuds and marriages and lawsuits and voyages, with a psychological realism and narrative economy that modern readers still find startling. The sagas are how we know most of what we know about the details of Norse society in this period, and while the details are not always reliable in the modern historical sense, they are indispensable for the picture they preserve of a world that would otherwise be largely lost. One of the most famous of the saga stories concerns a red-bearded, red-tempered Norwegian man named Eric, who was exiled from Norway for killing a man, moved to Iceland, was exiled again from a district in Iceland for killing more men, and eventually decided that Iceland, at this rate, might not have space for him much longer. In the summer of 982, he loaded his household onto a ship and sailed west, following a rumor that certain earlier voyagers had reported land beyond the western horizon. He found it. What he found was an enormous island, largely covered in ice, with narrow strips of habitable coastline along its southwestern edge, where the summer was just warm enough and long enough to allow certain kinds of farming and stock raising. Eric spent 3 years exploring this land during his exile from Iceland, and when he was able to return, he did what any competent settlement promoter of any period would do. He named the place with an eye to attracting investors. He called it Greenland, on the theory that a name suggesting fertility would draw more colonists than a name suggesting what the place actually looked like, which was ice. In 985, he led a colonizing expedition from Iceland to Greenland, consisting of 25 ships, of which 14 survived the crossing. The colony he founded eventually reached a population of somewhere between 2 and 5,000 people at its height. It built stone churches. It supported a resident bishop from the early 12th century onward. It traded with Iceland, and through Iceland, with the wider Norse world. It survived on that difficult coast for close to 500 years, before the combination of climate cooling in the 15th century, the collapse of its Atlantic trade routes, and the arrival of the Thule Inuit from the north brought it to its slow, poorly documented end sometime in the 1400s. When European voyagers returned to Greenland in the 16th and 17th centuries, they found ruins where the Norse farms had stood and no living Norse people at all. What exactly happened to the last Greenlanders is a question that continues to attract scholarly attention and probably always will. But before that ending came, and this is the point in the story that is genuinely astonishing, the Greenlanders looked further west. And what they found there is the reason that a certain number of history textbooks have had to be quietly revised over the past 60 years. Eric the Red had a son named Leif, who was born in Iceland and grew up in Greenland. Around the year 1000, Leif took a ship and a crew of 35 men and sailed west from Greenland, following a report from a Norse trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson, who had been blown off course some years earlier and had glimpsed unknown coastlines to the west without landing on them. Leif retraced Bjarni's route in reverse. He landed first at a place he called Helluland, meaning flat stone land, which historians identify with Baffin Island. He sailed south to a place he called Markland, meaning forest land, which is generally identified as somewhere on the Labrador coast. He continued south to a place he called Vinland, meaning wine land, because his men found what they described as wild grapes growing there, along with wild wheat and salmon of an unusual size. He established a base, wintered there, and returned to Greenland the following spring. The location of Vinland was, for centuries, treated by academic historians as a matter of pure legend. The sagas that described Leif's voyage were regarded as too fantastic, too full of the ordinary saga elements of dragons and prophecy and improbable violence, to be taken seriously as geographic records. Then, in 1960, a Norwegian husband and wife team of archaeologists, Helging Stad and Ann Steining Stad, began excavating a site on the northern tip of Newfoundland at a place called Elance Orks Meadows. What they found, over the course of 7 summers of careful excavation, was the remains of a Norse settlement. Turf houses of characteristic Norse construction, iron nails of Norse manufacture, a bronze pin of Norse type, a soapstone spindle whirl. Radiocarbon dating of the site placed it consistently around the year 1000, plus or minus a few decades. The archaeological consensus that emerged, and that has strengthened with subsequent research, is that Elance Orks Meadows was almost certainly the base camp used by Leif Erikson and his successors. It appears not to have been a permanent settlement, more a working station for further exploration and resource extraction along the coasts to the south, where the actual Vinland with its grapes and salmon was probably located, most likely somewhere in what is now New Brunswick or Maine. The Norse presence in North America seems to have lasted, on and off, for perhaps a decade or two, and then to have been abandoned. The reasons appear to have been simple and practical. The distance from Greenland was too great. The local population, whom the Norse called the Skraelings, was hostile in a way that the Norse were not equipped to overcome with the small numbers they could send. The trip did not pay for itself. The Greenlanders, having discovered a continent, quietly stopped visiting it. The consequences of this discovery are worth pausing on. The Norse reached the North American continent around the year 1000, which is roughly 500 years before Christopher Columbus made the crossing that would enter Western memory as the beginning of the European age of exploration. The Norse discovery did not change history because the Norse did not tell anyone outside their own world about it in a way that transformed European geographic thinking. The sagas mentioned it. Certain medieval Icelandic and Norwegian geographers noted the existence of a land beyond Greenland. But the news never made it into the mainstream of European learning. and by the time European voyagers returned to the Western Atlantic in the 15th century, they had no idea that anyone had been there before them. 5 centuries of one of history's larger secrets, kept quietly by a small community of farmers on a subarctic island, whose main written accomplishment was a body of family narratives that most of the world regarded as folklore until an archaeologist in Newfoundland dug up a Norse forge and settled the argument. While Leif Erikson was picking grapes on the Newfoundland coast, the Norse world he had come from was undergoing a transformation of a different kind, one that was slower, less visible, and considerably more consequential for the future of Europe. The pagans were becoming Christians, not all at once, not without resistance, not without a great many complicated compromises that produced a hybrid religious culture whose traces are still visible in the folklore of every country the Vikings settled. But steadily, generation by generation, king by king, the old gods were being replaced. The process was not a spiritual mystery. It was a political calculation, and the kings who made it because they had noticed certain things about the Christian world they were interacting with. Christian kingdoms had written laws. They had literate administrations. They had diplomatic relationships with other Christian kingdoms that could be leveraged for trade, marriage alliances, and military support. They had, above all, a theological framework in which royal authority was directly underwritten by divine authority in a way that Norse paganism, with its fractious pantheon and its emphasis on personal honor between roughly equal chieftains, had never quite managed to provide. A Christian king could claim to rule by the grace of God. A pagan king could claim to be descended from Odin, which was flattering, but did not, in practice, prevent one's cousins from mounting a rebellion at the first sign of weakness. The first major Norse ruler to convert formally was Harald Bluetooth of Denmark, sometime around the year 965. He is one of the more entertaining figures in the entire Viking Age, partly because of what he accomplished, and partly because of the name that has attached itself to him for reasons that are still not entirely settled. The nickname Bluetooth may refer to a dead or discolored tooth. It may be a corruption of an older Danish word for a swarthy or dark-complexioned man. It may be an entirely unrelated compound that later linguists have been unable to disentangle. Whatever its origin, it has proved unusually durable. In 1997, a Swedish engineer named Jim Kardach, working on a short-range wireless communication standard for connecting different types of electronic devices, chose the name Bluetooth for his new technology as a reference to Harald's role in unifying disparate Scandinavian peoples under a single authority. The logo he designed combined the runes for Harald's initials, H and B in the Elder Futhark, into a single glyph. If you are reading this on a phone tonight, and if that phone has ever paired with a wireless headset or a car stereo, there is a small monogram on your screen that is, quite literally, the initials of a 10th century Danish king. History occasionally arranges its jokes with an unusual patience. Harald Bluetooth's conversion is recorded on a monument he raised at Jelling in Denmark, a large runestone that still stands where he placed it. The inscription describes him as the king who made the Danes Christian, and it is generally regarded as one of the founding documents of the Danish nation-state. Harald built churches, invited missionaries, and reorganized the political structure of his kingdom along the more centralized lines that Christian kingship elsewhere in Europe had been developing for centuries. He was, in effect, the first Danish king in the modern sense, ruling a unified kingdom rather than a coalition of chieftains. His methods, one should note, were not universally gentle. Conversion in Scandinavia, as elsewhere, involved a certain amount of persuasion at sword point, where persuasion by other means was proving slow. His son Sweyn Forkbeard rebelled against him, and Harald died fighting his own child. Sweyn himself, once he had secured his throne, continued the transition to Christianity while pursuing an active military policy against Anglo-Saxon England, and eventually, in the last years of his life, actually captured the English throne, a story we will need to return to shortly. His son Sinutt would go on to rule an empire spanning Denmark, Norway, and England, a Norse Christian ruler whose reign represented perhaps the high-water mark of Scandinavian political influence in medieval Europe. Norway followed Denmark into Christianity, though with considerably more difficulty. The Norwegian king Olaf Tryggvason, who came to the throne in 995 after a career that had included stints as a Norse mercenary in the Baltic and as a raider on the English coasts, was a convert of the more enthusiastic sort. He conducted his campaign of conversion with a combination of missionary preaching, direct threats, and when neither of those produced the desired results, the destruction of pagan temples and the forcible baptism of communities that had preferred to remain unbaptized. His methods were effective in the short term and produced considerable resentment in the long term. He died in the year 1000 at the Battle of Esvolda, defeated by a coalition of enemies that included his own recently converted subjects who had reached certain conclusions about their new king's temperament. The completion of Norwegian conversion fell to a later Olaf Haraldsson, who reigned from 1015 to 1028. His methods were, if anything, harsher than his predecessors, and he was eventually driven from his throne by a rebellion of his own nobles. He was killed at the Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, attempting to return from exile. And then, in one of those historical ironies that suggests the universe occasionally has a sense of humor, the same population that had killed him spent the next generation reassessing their opinion of him. Miracles were reported at his grave. His body, when exhumed, was found to be uncorrupted. He was declared a saint within a year of his death. The king who had been too zealous a Christian to be tolerated in life became, in death, the most important saint in Norwegian history and the patron of the Norwegian nation. Nidaros Cathedral, built over his shrine, became one of the great pilgrimage sites of Northern Europe. Saint Olaf remains, to this day, a central figure in Norwegian identity. The population that killed him spent the next 1,000 years making up for it. Iceland's conversion took a different form entirely, which was in keeping with everything else Iceland did differently. In the year 1000, at the annual meeting of the Althing, the assembled chieftains faced a decision. Missionary pressure from Norway had produced a substantial Christian community in Iceland, and the pagans and Christians had reached the point of open conflict. Rather than allow the country to descend into religious civil war, they submitted the question to arbitration. The law speaker, a pagan named Thorgeir, was given authority to decide the matter for the whole country. He retired to his booth, laid his cloak over his head, and remained under the cloak for a day and a night without speaking. When he emerged, he ruled that Iceland would officially become a Christian country, but that pagans would be allowed to continue their private worship if they were discreet about it, and certain traditional practices, such as the eating of horse meat, would be permitted to continue for a transitional period. It was essentially a political compromise between religious factions, arrived at by a pagan who was asked to arbitrate a question that primarily concerned the future of the community. Iceland became Christian by legislative vote, without a war, and the transition was managed with a degree of pragmatic negotiation that would have been unimaginable almost anywhere else in early medieval Europe. Meanwhile, one of the most consequential Norse conversions of the entire Viking Age had been happening quietly, several decades earlier, in a corner of northern France, and its consequences would loop back to reshape everything else we have been describing tonight. The Norse raids on the Frankish kingdom had continued through the 9th century with a regularity that eventually exhausted the Frankish capacity to keep paying them off. Paris was besieged by a Norse fleet in 885 in a spectacular set-piece engagement that lasted through most of the following winter and involved several thousand ships making their way up the Seine. The city held, largely through the leadership of a Frankish count named Odo, but the siege demonstrated once again that the Norse could operate on the great rivers of France almost at will, and that the Frankish kings had run out of ideas for stopping them. In 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple tried a new approach. He met with a Norse chieftain named Rollo, who had established himself with a substantial force at the mouth of the Seine, and negotiated a treaty. The terms were extraordinary, and their consequences would ripple across European history for the next 1,000 years. Charles agreed to grant Rollo a substantial stretch of the northern French coast, essentially the region around Rouen, in exchange for two things. First, Rollo would convert to Christianity and become the king's vassal. Second, Rollo would use his Norse forces to defend the granted territory against future Norse raids from other groups. Charles was, in effect, hiring a poacher as a gamekeeper. He was giving one Norse warlord a legitimate territorial base in exchange for that warlord's cooperation in keeping the other Norse warlords out. The treaty was signed at St. Clair-sur-Epte. Rollo was baptized. He accepted the king's terms, with one famous quibble about the required gesture of feudal homage. When invited to kiss the king's foot, Rollo, according to later Norman tradition, refused to bend down and instead ordered one of his warriors to perform the gesture for him. The warrior lifted the king's foot to his own mouth, tipping Charles backward off his throne in the process. The story may be embellished, but it captures something about the transactional nature of the relationship. Rollo was becoming a Frankish lord, but he was doing so on terms that he considered non-negotiable regarding the dignity of his own person. The territory Rollo received became known as Normandy, from the old French word for Northmen. The Norse who settled there adopted the French language, converted to Christianity, adopted Frankish customs of feudal governance, and over the course of the next century and a half, transformed themselves into one of the most formidable military and political forces in Europe. They kept certain things from their Norse heritage: their genealogies, their taste for military adventure, their willingness to travel enormous distances to fight for pay and land. But they wore the clothes of French knights, spoke the language of French courts, and served the church with the enthusiasm of the recently converted. They called themselves Normans, and by the middle of the 11th century, they were the most talked about people in Western Europe. They fought in Spain. They fought in southern Italy, where a family of Norman adventurers led by the sons of a minor nobleman named Tancred of Hauteville carved out a kingdom that eventually included Sicily. They fought in the First Crusade, where a Norman named Bohemond became one of the leading figures of the entire campaign. And in Normandy itself, they were ruled through the 10th and 11th centuries by a line of dukes descended directly from Rollo, each of whom expanded the duchy's power and its network of French and English alliances. The sixth duke in this line, born around 1028, was a boy named William. William of Normandy was born the illegitimate son of Duke Robert of Normandy and a young woman named Herlever, the daughter of a tanner in the town of Falaise. His illegitimacy would follow him his entire life. His enemies, of whom he acquired a substantial collection early and never entirely shook off, called him William the Bastard, and it was not always intended as a compliment. He preferred, when he had the opportunity to choose his own titles, William the Conqueror. He would eventually earn both, though the second one required a considerable investment of effort to establish. When his father Robert died in 1035, returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, William was 7 years old. Normandy at that moment was in a state that historians have generally characterized with polite understatement as unstable. The duchy was ruled, at least in theory, by a boy who could not yet ride a war horse, and the Norman nobility was composed of men descended from Rollo's original warband, whose commitment to the principle of orderly succession was, to put it charitably, contingent on circumstances. Several of William's guardians were murdered during his childhood, sometimes in his own presence. One of them, his tutor, was killed while sleeping in the same room as the young duke. The message, insofar as anyone bothered to send one, was that a bastard child duke was not a serious obstacle to any adult with sufficient ambition and a functional set of household troops. That William survived at all is a considerable historical accident, and that he survived long enough to consolidate his position and eventually rule as one of the most formidable Norman dukes of the entire century is the result of a combination of patient scheming, careful marriage alliances, sustained military campaigning against his own barons, and a temperament that did not, apparently, respond well to setbacks by becoming discouraged. By the time he reached his early 30s, William had brought Normandy under a degree of ducal control that was unusually firm by the standards of 11th century French feudal politics. He had married Matilda of Flanders, connecting himself to one of the wealthier northern French principalities. He had reformed his relationship with the church, endowing monasteries with enough consistency to earn a general reputation for piety that later apologists would find useful. And he had, most importantly for our purposes, developed a claim, which he took extremely seriously, to the throne of England. The claim ran through his great-aunt Emma of Normandy, who had been married first to the English king Ethelred the Unready, and then, after Ethelred's death and the Norse conquest of England, to Cnut the Great himself. Emma's son by Ethelred was Edward, who had lived in exile in Normandy during Cnut's reign, and had returned to England in 1042 to take the throne after Cnut's line failed. Edward the Confessor, the pious, childless, Norman-educated king whose reign we discussed briefly earlier, had spent his youth being sheltered by the Norman ducal family, and his relationships with his Norman relatives were, throughout his life, closer than his relationships with most of his English subjects. William claimed that during his own reign, Edward had promised him the English throne. The evidence for this promise is not documentary in a modern sense, but it is not implausible either. Edward had every reason to feel gratitude toward the family that had sheltered him during his exile. William was his second cousin once removed. The two men had met. And when Edward died in January 1066 without a direct male heir, William was very clear about his position, which was that he was the legitimate successor, and that anyone who claimed otherwise was in error. The additional element in William's claim, the one that made it not merely dynastic, but morally charged, was an oath he claimed had been sworn to him by Harold Godwinson himself, the English earl who would eventually take the English throne in defiance of William's position. Sometime around 1064, Harold had travelled to Normandy, apparently on a mission from Edward the Confessor, whose exact purpose is disputed. During his stay, according to Norman accounts, he had sworn a solemn oath on relics to support William's claim to the English throne. The Bayeux Tapestry, that extraordinary embroidered narrative made a decade after the conquest, depicts the moment of the oath with considerable detail, showing Harold standing between two reliquaries with his hands touching each. Whether Harold understood the significance of the objects he was swearing on, or was coerced into swearing, or considered the oath binding, or considered it non-binding because sworn under duress, are questions that have been argued about since the 11th century without resolution. What is not in doubt is that William believed, or acted as though he believed, that Harold had committed himself to supporting the Norman claim, and that Harold's subsequent decision to accept the English crown for himself was an act of perjury as well as usurpation. So when Edward the Confessor died on the 5th of January 1066, and Harold Godwinson was crowned the following day at Westminster in a ceremony whose speed suggested it had been planned in advance, William of Normandy responded exactly as one might expect. He called his council together, laid out his claim to the assembled Norman nobility, and began the process of assembling an invasion force of a size that no Norman duke had ever previously commanded. The scale of the undertaking is worth pausing on. William was not the king of a nation-state. He was a duke, technically a vassal of the French crown, ruling a territory with a population of perhaps 1 million people. To assemble an army large enough to invade England, defeat the English king in battle, and hold the conquered territory afterward, he would need to draw not only on the resources of Normandy itself, but on the willingness of nobles across northern France, Flanders, and Brittany to contribute men, ships, and money to a speculative overseas adventure. He would need papal blessing, both for the legitimacy it would provide and for the moral pressure it could apply to potential opponents. He would need a fleet substantial enough to transport several thousand armored men, thousands of horses, and enormous quantities of supplies across the English Channel. He would need, above all, a plan for what to do with all of this once it landed on an English beach. He acquired all of it methodically across the spring and summer of 1066. The papal blessing came in the form of a banner, sent from Rome by Pope Alexander II, which William would fly above his army as a mark of divine sanction. The fleet was built through the spring and early summer at ports along the Norman coast, with roughly 700 ships being constructed or requisitioned. The army swelled through the accession of contingents from Brittany, from Flanders, from northern France, from anywhere ambitious younger sons could be persuaded that a share of English land was worth the risk of a channel crossing and a set-piece battle. By August, William had his invasion force assembled at the mouth of the Dives and later at St. Valery-sur-Somme. And then he waited. He waited because he had to. The wind was wrong. To cross the channel with a fleet the size he had assembled required a sustained southerly wind that would carry the ships across without dispersing them. Through August and much of September, the winds continued to blow from the north, and William's army sat on the beaches of northern France, consuming supplies and testing the patience of commanders who had committed themselves to a campaign that could not begin. Meanwhile, and this is where the story loops back to the thread we set aside earlier, another Norse commander was making his own preparations several hundred miles to the north. Harald Hardrada of Norway, the former commander of the Varangian Guard, the veteran of Byzantine campaigns from Sicily to Syria, the accumulated fortune of a lifetime of imperial service now backing his ambitions in the northern world, had reached a decision. He was 51 years old. He had ruled Norway for 20 years. He had unfinished business. Hardrada's claim to the English throne was rooted in an agreement made decades earlier between Harthacnut, one of Sinut's sons who had ruled England briefly in the 1040s, and Magnus the Good of Norway. The two kings had reportedly agreed that if either died without an heir, the survivor would inherit the other's kingdom. Harthacnut died. Magnus claimed the succession. Edward the Confessor was crowned instead. Magnus died before pressing his claim, and Hardrada, who succeeded him in Norway, inherited the theoretical grievance. For most of his reign, he had not acted on it. There had been other wars closer to home, wars against Denmark that consumed decades of his attention. But in 1066, with Edward dead and Harold Godwinson crowned in defiance of multiple competing claims, Hardrada saw an opening. He was encouraged in this by a most unlikely ally. Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own younger brother, had been Earl of Northumbria until a rebellion by his own subjects had driven him into exile the previous year. Tostig had spent the intervening months traveling around northern Europe, attempting to find someone who would help him regain his position. He had approached William of Normandy. He had approached the Danish king Sweyn Estridsson. He had finally approached Harold Hardrada, whose interest in the English throne coincided with Tostig's interest in returning to Northumbria under new terms. The two men reached an agreement. Hardrada would provide the fleet and the army. Tostig would provide local knowledge, allies within England, and a claim to the local Northumbrian earldom that would legitimize the Norwegian presence in the north. In early September 1066, Hardrada assembled at the Norwegian coast, a fleet variously estimated at between 200 and 300 ships, and a force of perhaps 8,000 to 9,000 men. This was a substantial army by the standards of the age, and it represented, though nobody quite realized it at the time, the last great Norse invasion fleet of the classical Viking pattern. Longships, sons of raiders. A pagan-tinged culture of martial reputation that reached back through the generations to the men who had landed at Lindisfarne 270 years earlier. Hardrada himself was in some sense the last great Viking king in the older meaning of the word. He had made his fortune as a Norse warrior in Constantinople. He had ruled Norway with the hard hand that had earned him his nickname. And he was now sailing west, with his son Olaf beside him and Tostig's smaller fleet joining him at the Orkney Islands, on a campaign whose ending he could not have anticipated. He landed on the northeast coast of England in mid-September 1066, sailed up the Humber, and disembarked his army near York. On the 20th of September, he defeated the northern English earls Edwin and Morcar at the Battle of Fulford Gate. York opened its gates to him. He accepted the submission of the city and encamped his army a few miles east, at Stamford Bridge, to await the formal delivery of hostages and provisions from the surrounding region. Down south, in London, Harold Godwinson received the news of the invasion within days, and what he did next was, by any measure, one of the more remarkable military movements of the entire medieval period. Harold Godwinson had spent the summer of 1066 waiting for William. He had assembled the English fyrd along the southern coast, watched the channel for Norman sails, and maintained his forces in a state of readiness through August and into September. By early September, the fyrd had reached the limit of the time it could remain in the field. The harvest was coming in, supplies were running low, and Harold, calculating that the season for a Norman invasion was passing, had released the militia to return to their farms. He himself had returned to London. The news of Hardrada's landing in the north reached him within days. What Harold did next has been described by military historians with a consistent note of admiration that transcends their usual professional reserve. He assembled what he could of his household troops and whatever fyrd forces could be quickly recalled, and he began to march north. The distance from London to York, following the old Roman road that ran through the East Midlands, is roughly 200 miles. Harold covered it in 4 days. The pace is difficult to comprehend for a modern reader without some understanding of medieval military logistics. An army in the 11th century, moving with baggage and infantry, was expected to cover perhaps 10 to 15 miles a day. 20 miles was hard marching. Harold was moving at close to 50 miles a day, sustained across 4 consecutive days, with an army composed partly of mounted household troops and partly of foot soldiers who had been picked up along the route as messengers reached the districts through which he passed. He arrived in Yorkshire on the morning of the 25th of September with a force that Hardrada, encamped comfortably at Stamford Bridge and awaiting the delivery of hostages he had negotiated for, was not remotely expecting to see. The account preserved in later Norse sagas, and probably compressed and dramatized in the retelling, describes the Norwegian scouts spotting a great cloud of dust on the road from the west and asking what it could be. Someone remarked that it looked like an army. Hardrada replied that it could not be an army because Harold Godwinson was hundreds of miles to the south watching for William. As the cloud drew closer and the sun caught the tips of spears and the surfaces of shields, the Norse commanders realized their mistake. It was an army. It was Harold's army. And a substantial portion of the Norwegian force, having left their heavier armor with the ships at Rickall several miles away because the day was warm and they had expected only ceremonial business, was now facing an English attack in leather jerkins and light clothing. The Battle of Stamford Bridge, fought on the 25th of September 1066, was in most respects a straightforward English victory, won at high cost. Hardrada held the eastern side of a wooden bridge over the river Derwent with a rear guard, while his main force organized itself on the higher ground beyond. The rear guard held the bridge for hours against repeated English assaults, and later legend gave particular attention to a single enormous Norwegian who stood on the bridge itself and killed some 40 Englishmen with an axe before being finally overcome by a soldier who floated under the bridge in a barrel and thrust a spear up through the gaps in the planks. The barrel detail is almost certainly folkloric. The prolonged fighting at the bridge is not. Once across the river, the English attacked the main Norse position. Hardrada fought at the front in the traditional manner of Norse kings and was killed relatively early in the engagement by an arrow to the throat. Tostig assumed command and continued the fight. Harold, according to the sagas, offered his brother a truce and the return of his earldom if he would abandon the Norwegian cause. Tostig, who had by this point committed himself too far, refused. The fighting continued until nearly all of the Norse army was dead. Late in the battle, a reinforcement contingent that had been left with the ships at Rickall arrived on foot, having sprinted the several miles from the coast in full armor to reach their king. They arrived exhausted, engaged briefly, and were also destroyed. Tostig was killed. The remaining Norwegians, cornered against the river, were finally offered terms. The scale of the Norwegian defeat is captured most concisely by a single detail. Hardrada had arrived with a fleet estimated at somewhere between 200 and 300 ships. Harold allowed the survivors to depart on the condition that they never return, and the number of ships required to carry the surviving Norsemen home was 24. The rest of the fleet was left on the English coast as a memorial to what had happened. Hardrada's body was eventually returned to Norway for burial. His son Olaf, who had remained with the fleet and was not present at the battle, was among those permitted to sail home. The last great Viking king was dead. The pattern of Norse invasion that had reshaped English history for 2.5 centuries had, in effect, ended at Stamford Bridge on that September afternoon. Harold Godwinson had won a spectacular victory. His army had marched 200 miles in 4 days, destroyed a Norse invasion force, killed one of the most feared warriors in Europe, and put an end to the Scandinavian threat that had loomed over England for generations. If the story of 1066 had ended there, Harold would have entered English memory as one of the great warrior kings of the age, comparable to Alfred, remembered for a campaign of extraordinary speed and decisive effect. The story did not end there. 3 days after the battle at Stamford Bridge, on the 28th of September, the wind in the English Channel changed, and William of Normandy, whose fleet had been waiting in northern France for months for exactly this shift, embarked his invasion force and sailed for England. He landed at Pevensey on the Sussex coast on the 29th of September. He was unopposed. The southern coast of England, which Harold had watched all summer, was now empty of English defenders, all of them either dead in Yorkshire or marching back south with a king who had just fought the battle of his life. William landed his horses. He established a fortified base. He began, methodically, to devastate the surrounding countryside, both to feed his army and to demonstrate to the local population the cost of any resistance. Harold received the news of William's landing at York, where he was resting his army after Stamford Bridge. What he did next has been debated by military historians for 9 centuries. He could have waited. He could have stayed in the north long enough to fully recover his forces, called up fresh troops from across the country, and marched south with an army twice the size of the one he actually took. William's supply situation was precarious. His forces could not remain indefinitely on the Sussex coast without either advancing inland or exhausting the food they could gather locally. Time was, in the strategic sense, on Harold's side. Instead, Harold moved south with the speed that had served him at Stamford Bridge. He covered the 200 miles back to London in a matter of days, paused briefly to gather what reinforcements he could, and marched on toward the Sussex coast with an army that was substantially the same force that had just fought a major battle in Yorkshire. Still tired, still short of certain contingents that had not yet arrived from the more distant parts of the country. Whether Harold was driven by overconfidence after Stamford Bridge, by anger at what William's forces were doing to Sussex villages, by the fear that a slower response would allow William to consolidate a defensible position, or by some combination of all of these motivations, historians have never quite settled. What is certain is that he arrived in the hills north of Hastings on the evening of the 13th of October, with an army that was smaller than it might have been, more tired than it should have been, and about to be tested against a force that was, in almost every relevant respect, better prepared to fight than his own. The Battle of Hastings was fought on the 14th of October, 1066, on a ridge of ground where the town of Battle now stands, its name preserved from the event that gave it a reason to exist. Harold arranged his forces along the crest of the ridge in the traditional Anglo-Saxon shield wall, several ranks deep, presenting a solid front of overlapping shields and thrusting spears along a line perhaps 600 yards wide. The position was strong. William, arriving in the valley below with his combined force of Norman knights, Breton and French infantry, and archers, had to attack uphill against a fortified line in ground that gave every tactical advantage to the defender. The battle lasted most of the day, which was unusual by the standards of the period. Set-piece medieval engagements were generally decided within a few hours, one way or the other. Hastings ran from morning until dusk, and its course involved a series of Norman assaults on the English shield wall that were repulsed one after another with heavy Norman casualties. William's infantry could not break the line. His archers could not reach the men behind the shields with any effectiveness. His cavalry charges up the hill were disrupted by the difficulty of the ground and shattered against the wall of shields at the top. At one point in the middle of the day, a rumor spread through the Norman army that William himself had been killed, and a portion of the Norman line broke and began to retreat. William, whose personal survival was becoming the critical question of the engagement, rode forward with his helmet raised, showing his face to his men and shouting that he was alive. The retreat was rallied. What happened next was, according to Norman accounts, the turning point of the battle. As the retreating Norman contingents were pursued down the hill by a section of the English line that had broken ranks to chase them, the Normans turned and cut down the exposed pursuers. The maneuver, whether accidental or deliberate, was so successful that William apparently ordered it repeated. Feigned retreats, drawing the disciplined English line into breaking its own formation, became the tactic that gradually pulled the shield wall apart. By late afternoon, the English line was thinner than it had been at dawn, exhausted from a day of defending against repeated assaults, and no longer able to maintain the tight formation that had been its strength. Harold was killed at some point in the closing hours of the battle. The Bayeux tapestry shows a figure falling in the vicinity of the Latin inscription identifying his death, and shows a nearby figure pulling an arrow from what appears to be the region of his face. Whether Harold died from the arrow or from Norman knights riding him down as the English line collapsed, or from some combination of both, is another of the pleasantly unresolved questions of the period. By nightfall, the battle was over. The English army had disintegrated. Harold was dead. And William of Normandy, direct descendant of the Norse chieftain Rollo, who had accepted baptism at St. Clair-sur-Epte 155 years earlier, was in effective possession of southern England. Consider what actually happened in the autumn of 1066. On the 25th of September, at Stamford Bridge in Yorkshire, an English king killed a Norse king in what looked, at the time, and to everyone present, like the definitive end of the Viking Age in England. Harold Hardrada was the last of the great pagan-tinged warrior kings whose reputation reached back through the generations to the raiders at Lindisfarne. His death was, in one sense, the closing of a chapter that had opened 273 years earlier on that quiet June morning off the Northumbrian coast. 19 days later, at Hastings in Sussex, a different king with different armor and a different language and a different flag defeated the same English army and took the throne of England. William was, in every technical sense, a Frenchman. He spoke French. He came from a French duchy. He served, in feudal theory, the French king. The men who came with him wore the mail hauberks and conical helmets of Frankish knights, fought in the mounted style that Frankish military culture had developed over the previous 2 centuries, and carried themselves as members of an aristocratic tradition that had nothing obvious to do with the world of the longships and the shield walls. But if you traced the genealogies, if you looked at where these Normans had actually come from, the picture was rather different. William was the great-great-great-grandson of Rollo. His companions in arms carried names that had been Norse names 3 generations earlier, adapted now into French spelling and pronunciation, but still recognizable in their roots. The Norman military aristocracy of 1066 was, in the strict biological sense, the same people as the Viking raiders who had terrorized the Frankish coasts in the 9th century. What had changed was the packaging. They had converted to Christianity. They had learned French. They had adopted feudal titles and continental fashions. They had, in effect, upgraded from the Viking operating system to the Frankish one. But the underlying hardware, if we can extend the metaphor, was Norse, which means that the Viking Age did not end in 1066. It ended and continued in the same year in 2 different battles fought 19 days apart, and it depended entirely on which door you looked at. Through one door at Stamford Bridge, the Vikings lost. Through the other door at Hastings, the Vikings won. The descendants of the raiders had simply, over the course of 5 generations, transformed themselves so completely that when they conquered England, nobody thought to call it a Viking conquest. It was a Norman conquest. The men who did it had the same ancestors as the men who had failed at Stamford Bridge, but they were operating under a new corporate identity, and the corporate identity was what everyone at the time recognized. This is why the standard division of European history that treats 1066 as the end of the Viking Age is both true and misleading. It is true because no more longships would come out of Scandinavia in the classical Viking pattern to invade the British Isles. The military and political phenomenon that had begun at Lindisfarne was, as a distinct historical episode, complete. But it is misleading because the people who had been doing the Viking work were still there, still in charge, still expanding their influence across Europe. They had just changed their clothes. The Norman Kingdom of Sicily, the Norman principalities of the Crusader states, the Norman baronies of Wales and Scotland, and above all the Norman monarchy of England, were all in a certain sense the continuation of the Norse expansion by other means. The children of Rollo would rule England for the rest of the medieval period. Every English monarch from William through to the modern royal family carries some proportion of that ancestry. What William did to England after 1066 is a story for another night. The Doomsday Book, the castles rising in every county, the systematic replacement of the Anglo-Saxon aristocracy with a Norman one, the French vocabulary flowing into English speech and gradually producing the hybrid language we speak tonight. All of it was, in a certain sense, a Norse achievement conducted in French. And when English speakers today say Wednesday, meaning Odin's Day, or Thursday, meaning Thor's Day, or Friday, meaning Freya's Day, they are, without particularly thinking about it, invoking the gods of the people who came off the ships at Lindisfarne. The Norse pantheon lost the religious argument in the 10th and 11th centuries, but it kept the calendar. In Scandinavia itself, the end of the Viking Age was slower and less dramatic than any single battle. Through the 11th and 12th centuries, the Scandinavian kingdoms consolidated into the recognizable ancestors of modern Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Christianity, which had begun as a political calculation by kings, became a deep and durable feature of the culture. The trade networks that had run from Constantinople to Newfoundland were gradually rerouted through more conventional Mediterranean and Baltic channels, as the political maps of Europe and Asia hardened into patterns that had less room for the fluid, opportunistic movement of the Norse traders. The longships, no longer needed for the long-distance raids that had originally justified their construction, gave way to different kinds of vessels adapted for different purposes. By the 13th century, the Scandinavian world was, in its political and religious structure, largely indistinguishable from the rest of Northern Europe. It had joined the continental system it had once been an alternative to. The Greenland colony, that improbable outpost of Norse civilization on the edge of North America, held on until the 15th century before slipping into a slow, poorly documented extinction. The Icelandic Republic, which had governed itself through the Althing for over 3 centuries, lost its independence to Norway in 1262 and would not regain it until 1944. The Eastern Norse settlements along the great rivers were absorbed into the Slavic polities they had helped to found, contributing their genes and their vocabulary and their trading networks to what became Kievan Rus and eventually Russia, but ceasing to exist as a distinctively Norse presence sometime in the 12th century. The Vinland voyages were forgotten by everyone except the Icelanders, and largely disbelieved even by them, until an archaeologist's spade in Newfoundland in 1960 turned up the evidence that had been sitting in the sagas all along. The Varangian Guard continued to serve the Byzantine emperors, gradually shifting its recruitment from Norsemen to Anglo-Saxon exiles fleeing William's England, and then to a broader pool of northern European mercenaries, until Constantinople itself fell to the Fourth Crusade in 1204, and the Guard as a distinct institution effectively ended. And the runestones raised across Scandinavia and the Norse diaspora, those blunt, direct memorials to the men who died in England or Byzantium or the eastern rivers, weathered slowly in the fields where they had been placed, most of them still legible today, still telling their small, specific stories about men whose names would otherwise have vanished from memory 1,000 years ago. What did the Vikings leave behind? A great many things, though most of them are easier to see once you know to look for them. Half the place names in the north and east of England. The counties of Yorkshire and Lincolnshire and Nottinghamshire, all of them shaped in their basic administrative geography by Norse settlement patterns. A significant portion of the vocabulary of everyday English. Words like sky and window and knife and law and give and take, and even the pronoun they, the Parliament of Iceland. the nation-states of Denmark, Norway, and Sweden in their basic geographic outlines, the Norman line of English kings, and through them, the entire political culture that eventually produced Magna Carta and Parliament and English common law. A body of literature, the sagas, that remains one of the most sophisticated prose traditions of the medieval world. A logo on your phone. They also left behind an idea, though this one is harder to specify precisely. The idea that a small population of stubborn, mobile, seaborne people, operating from marginal territory at the edge of the known world, could reshape the political geography of an entire continent through a combination of technological advantage, opportunistic aggression, and the willingness to travel further than anyone expected them to travel. The Vikings were not the first people to do this in European history, and they would not be the last, but they did it on a scale and with a range that has kept historians occupied for centuries. Their achievement was disproportionate to their numbers, which is what has made them such an enduring subject of study and in more recent generations of considerable popular fascination. And they left behind, in every English-speaking country, in every European country whose language and legal traditions run back to the medieval period, a slightly different world than the one that would have existed without them. If the raiders had not come to Lindisfarne, Alfred would never have needed to build the burhs, and Wessex would not have become the nucleus of a unified English kingdom, and the political tradition that emerged from that unification would have followed some different course, unknowable now, into some different modernity. If Rollo had not accepted the treaty at St. Clair-sur-Epte, there would have been no Normandy, no William, no 1066 in the form we know it, and the language you are hearing tonight would not exist in this precise form. The counterfactual histories multiply the more one thinks about it. Every major event in the story we have followed tonight branches into a set of unrealized alternatives whose combined weight suggests that the world we actually live in owes rather more to the men who came off those ships at Lindisfarne than we generally acknowledge. The longships themselves are gone. A handful survive as archaeological finds, preserved in the anaerobic mud of burial mounds where Norse chieftains were laid to rest with their vessels around them. The Oseberg ship in Norway, the Gokstad ship, the 5 ships found at Roskilde in Denmark. You can go and see them in their museums and stand in front of them and take in the elegance of their lines and the ambition of their design and think about the men who built them and sailed them and eventually were buried in them. Everything else has rotted. The wooden halls where the mead was drunk, the runestones where the deeds were carved, the men themselves. But Thursday still belongs to Thor, and a small blue symbol on your phone, glowing quietly in the dark as you drift towards sleep tonight, is a monogram of a Danish king who died 1,040 years ago. History leaves stranger fingerprints than we usually notice. That is where we leave the Viking Age tonight. At the end of a long story that touched 3 continents, spanned 3 centuries, and left behind a world that is still, in ways both visible and hidden, shaped by the choices of a small population of seafaring people who put out from the fjords in the 8th century and decided to see how far they could go. If you are still awake, there is another story waiting for you on screen right now. Just look up and you will find it. And if this one stayed with you, feel free to leave a like, hit subscribe, or drop a thought in the comments below. It genuinely means something to know you were here. For now, let your shoulders go. Let your eyes close. The longships and the shield walls and the runes carved into weathered stone are all a long, long time ago. You are somewhere warm and quiet, and there is nothing left to do tonight but rest. Good night. Peace.